Okay, welcome back, folks. My name is Lionel with Bison Transport, and I'm here with Mike and Steve. We'll have them introduce themselves in just a few moments here. But we're going to spend some time this afternoon to be able to talk about the ELD mandate, the technology, and really look at that topic from a shipper's perspective. So Mike, if I could just have you quickly introduce yourself, please.
Sure. Thank you, Lionel. I'm Mike Ludwick. I'm the Chief Administrative Officer at Bison Transport here. I've been with the organization for 20 plus years and looking forward to talking a little bit about electronic logs and how that's evolved through our organization.
Great, thank you, Mike. And Steve.
Steve Atnikov. I'm the Senior Sales Manager for Western Canada for Shaw Tracking. I've been with the company for 21 years and deal with most major fleets all across Western Canada.
Okay. So have you two gentlemen known each other for quite some time then?
Yes,
yeah?
Very long time.
All right,
long time.
Very good. Well, I appreciate you spending time with us today and our viewers as we go through this content here. So I've been with Bison now actually only almost 5 years, but in my 5 years here, ELDs have always been a hot topic. You know, I work closely with driver recruiting, and for years we would have drivers, oh, you have ELDs already? And they would promptly, hang up the phone. So those days are behind us, but definitely it's been a hot or even contentious topic for a lot of companies and drivers and really the entire industry. So we really wanted to look at where are ELDs at right now. The mandate is less than a half a year away, coming up in December. So if we could just start off, where are we at in terms of ELDs and the timeline coming up to this, the mandate in December? So, Steve,
as most people are aware, and if you pick up any trade magazine or any website, daily website, you'll see that the mandate is going into effect December 2017, December 18th. And if your trucks cross the border, you have no choice but to have an electronic logging device in the truck. Okay. So fleets are the ones that aren't compliant yet or aren't currently using an electronic logging device are, for lack of a better word, scrambling to find a solution quickly. And for our long-term existing customers, we're seeing that they've been adopting the solution over the last couple of years and are rolling it out throughout their fleet as we speak.
Okay, great. Thanks for the summary. So for a carrier that may be just running within Canada, I'm not sure the percentage of companies like that, for the most part, this mandate wouldn't apply to their business?
Currently, it would not apply, and we're going to find out how soon Canada is going to follow suit with the U.S. But we predict, and most fleets feel, that it's not going to be very long. It should happen rather quickly.
Okay. All right, great. And Mike, you'd have a lot of experience working directly with shippers. Do you have any perspective?
Well, I think at the start of the topic, I mean, the reality is that on December 18th, the hours of service regulations are not changing, and those have been in place for a long time. They do continue to evolve, but this mandate is about the electronic logging of the hours of service. So for our business as a long-time compliant fleet on hours of service, this is really about reinforcing the logging and keeping track of the information, which we've been doing for a number of years. But I'll say that among carriers in particular, there is a nervousness in the industry surrounding electronic logs, partly because of maybe a little bit of the unknown as to how it might be enforced or how it might actually be practically implemented. Among shippers, I would say there's probably less conversation than there needs to be, but that conversation is starting and is gathering momentum in the industry. I think as we get closer to the date and shippers begin to realize that there are a large percentage of carriers or a large number of trucks that are not ready to cross the border or operate in the U.S., there will be more sensitivity to it. But I think there's less readiness maybe than the shipper industry thinks, and there's some work to do.
Okay. All right, very good. Are there, will there be any impact to current supply chains? I know you talked about the hours of service versus the mandate, but are there certain lanes that maybe are working now and with ELDs in place that won't operate like that, or is that a non-issue?
I don't see that changing because the rules are the rules, okay. And if you're running compliant now, then that won't change at all. The only difference is that it's going to be monitored better from an enforcement standpoint. That's okay. Really.
Yeah, I think that for us, that's the real. We're excited about this change, not because it changes the regulations or the need to be compliant, but that it makes enforcement a little bit easier. And so it's, if someone is not currently operating under the rules, then it's a little bit easier to tell at roadside inspection or at weigh scale. And so we really see this as a leveling of the playing field to say that more carriers, all carriers, will be operating or carrying loads under the same enforcement mandate first in terms of compliance, hours of service compliance, but then the same level of enforcement with which for fleets that are ready and are using ELDs well, that's a benefit.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mike. So, Steve, if I could ask you this question, you have a lot of experience working with carriers like us and getting them onboarded. First, I guess, selling them and why they need to move towards this technology, and then onboarding them. And how long does it typically take for a carrier, if they haven't even started today, what is reasonable in terms of timeline for them to be able to get started and have it fully implemented?
I guess there's two ways to answer the question. The first would be if you're an existing customer already that has the technology in the truck, then really electronic logs is just an application that we enable on the fleet, and then we train drivers as we move forward. A fleet that hasn't been using any device at all in the truck can simply add the hardware to the vehicle, and then the training takes place. Typical time frame for an existing customer or even a new customer, most fleets will start with a group of drivers. We wouldn't take a fleet, for instance, of Bison with 1,400 trucks and say, we're turning the switch on tomorrow, you got to turn on 1,400 drivers. Right. It would just be chaos. But normally we typically will do a group of drivers. So fleets will start off with 10 drivers, and those 10 drivers will then start talking about how it's helping their lives, because there's always a few drivers that were scared at how it's going to affect. Yeah. And then the next group of drivers, and suddenly it spirals from there. And the input or the impact in the industry now is that it's really saving time, it's improving their quality of life. Drivers are adopting the technology very, very well. But it is a learning process. Right. It is something totally new, and there's always going to be some fear. Mm-hmm. But we are finding that drivers now would never go back to using paper.
Okay. Oh, very good. Thank you. All right, and Mike, how about, could you speak about Bison's process? We've been on ELDs for quite some time now.
Yeah, our safety crew recognized early in the process that this mandate was likely to happen, and we were excited about it and encouraged that this was something that would happen in our industry. So in 2013, we began our process to implement electronic logging. As Steve mentions, we already had the devices in our trucks, and turning them on was the easiest part of the exercise. But the work to figure out how to integrate that properly into your daily operational process, the communication to drivers to help them understand the benefits as well as overcome some of their potential resistance was important. Preparing all the training and then getting that training out to our drivers and fleets, not just on the operation of the ELD, but any clarifications for our safety teams on how to work with drivers. That took us the better part of a year to roll that all out fleet by fleet in our business. As Steve says, in general, our drivers responded really well. As I mentioned earlier on, we have long operated as a compliant fleet, so there really was no change for our drivers in terms of how they did the job. But getting used to that technology was a bit of a change for them, but feel like it went well. But it was not an insignificant piece of work for us. And maybe just a further clarification for as we move into the December 18th ELD mandate date. Today, the devices we have in our trucks don't meet the specific ELD regulations. And that's the case for the vast majority of carriers who are currently using onboard recorders. And the devices we're using and most of the industry is using is they're grandfathered to meet the mandate for a certain period of time, but there are a bunch of changes happening in terms of the final regulations around the technical specifications for ELDs. And it's not so easy just to understand when those take effect, how they take effect, what happens after the 18th in terms of new equipment, what happens to those devices beforehand, can I change which truck it's in, can I change which driver is using it. All those little nuances need to be understood by fleets so that when that driver gets into a roadside inspection, they can explain what they're using, how they're using it, when it was, what particular mandate it's following or how it's working, so that they aren't delayed at those stops. And I think not just the complexity of implementing these products, but making sure that you understand how the changes are going to roll out over the coming 6 months, 2 years, depending on what devices you're using. That's been really important for us, and I would say even as a fleet that's ready and is prepared for this change, is embracing the change, and is absolutely going to be able to service our customers, we're keeping our eyes closely on the changes that are still coming out all the time to make sure that we're ready for every day beyond the 18th.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for the extra information. Yeah, it's quite a complex process to be able to unroll everything, and I'm assuming that seeing the relationship between you two gentlemen, our two companies, having that relationship between the technology provider and the carrier is pretty important.
Yep.
I'm assuming a lot of carriers don't just buy the units and then go off on their own; that they need that ongoing support.
You truly need somebody in the office who can implement. You need what we call a champion, somebody who can take ownership of it and help with the drivers and roll it out properly with the education.
Mm-hmm. So you've both spoken quite a bit about all of the benefits to electronic logs. What was the holdup for a lot of the industry? Because there were and are still many companies waiting to be forced by law really to make this change.
I think initially for fleets that don't have any technology, that there's a cost, a concern about the cost. Is it expensive? Isn't it expensive? The cost of technology has come down so much these days that it's certainly something that's not anything that would scare anybody anymore. Do I need an in-cab device, a fixed mounted device? Do I want a portable device? There's questions there, and the compliance issue is a concern for fleets that maybe weren't running compliant or aren't currently running compliant. So that's something that scares some of the companies, and they say, well, I can't get the correct amount of work done in those proposed hours. But the reality is, and we keep talking about leveling the playing field, I mean, if you can't do what other fleets are doing in that time, then we have a bigger problem.
Right.
And this will hopefully eliminate that question that looms over everybody is, what's one fleet doing versus another fleet.
Right. Okay. Hey, do you have any comments, Mike, on what the holdup would have been?
I think, as a fleet, we embrace technology that helps with the safety or the productivity of our drivers. We've always believed in driving that change in our business. But the reality, as Steve says, it's an investment, and it's more costly to have those devices in the cab. And I think beyond that, there is likely some freight still moving in North America. We know that there's some freight moving in North America, either by shipper choice or carrier choice, that is difficult to do under the hours of service regulations. Like I said, it doesn't change with the December 18th mandate, but it helps with enforcement, and where that was maybe a gray area in the past, it becomes less confusing when the electronic logs are in place. We're encouraged to see that. Beyond that, I think there's just a general nervousness too about the technology sometimes. What is it capturing? How is it sharing that information? But good education has to help us get over those things, and we believe in communicating as much as we are with videos like this, communicating as much as possible to our peer fleets as well as to our customers about how to be ready.
Okay, great, thank you. So just to bring this home for shipper, just the last couple questions here. If there is a shipper currently working with some carriers, normally a shipper would have several carriers that would be helping them out, but if they have some carriers that currently aren't ELD compliant, what do you think a shipper should do in that case, over at least these next 6 months here?
Well, I think you're going to see more and more that shippers are going to be forced to, they won't have a choice but to use a fleet that's compliant, and so that's going to change maybe possibly who they're using. I think that, again, it's important to realize that if your truck's going into the U.S., you have no option. Okay. So you're going to have to find a shipper find a fleet that is compliant.
Yeah, for us, we encourage our customers or shippers to ask questions, see where their carrier base is at. Some of them are probably very ready. Some of them are at some point in the process. To the extent that somebody is not considering it, We still don't understand what that will look like in October and November. What will be the availability of devices? How easy will it be to train? What will be some of the challenges? If you run into a challenge during the implementation process right at the end, it's more difficult to recover from. So, we just encourage shippers to ask lots of questions and to be challenging carriers to say, hey, where are you at in the process? Share that with us so that we can work together to try to be ready.
Great, thanks, Mike. Maybe a quick follow-up question. I'm sure there was some companies that were holding on with the hopes that even though the mandate was passed, that it would eventually be repealed and actually not come into law. That seems fairly unlikely at this point. So assuming that there aren't changes to that happening or the mandate's date, do you have any thoughts on what will actually happen on December 19th in terms of enforcement? Is there any direction to the industry, what they can expect?
I think that we've seen that, and both of us happened to attend the same conference recently where somebody from the Federal Motor Carrier Association spoke and basically said that, if a vehicle doesn't have an electronic logging device, should it get pulled over and an inspection occurs, the protocol is going to be to ground that truck. So that hasn't really changed, Mike, unless you have something.
Yeah, I think that was a question from the floor at the conference where, and even for those carriers who are compliant, there's a nervousness there. What's going to happen when I'm at a roadside inspection? Sure. Which, of course, that's part of our business. And the representative was quite clear to say that we intend to enforce the regulations on the very next day. He gave some examples of how to transition through that week as the ELDs come into effect and how to backdate some of the information. And he was quite clear about the need for drivers to understand what they have in the cab, how it works, and be ready to explain that to any enforcement officer, and reinforces that it's not just turning on the device. It's about how much training you're doing with that driver and how ready they are to communicate and substantiate the records that they have on board. That's not a last day exercise. That's a piece of work that has to be deliberate and has to be well executed. And we as a carrier community during that session, we were encouraged to hear that that they firmly believe that this will happen on December 18th, and that their enforcement intends to be rigorous.
Okay, great. So just to wrap things up officially here, then, we've talked about a number of different topics here. What would you say would be the one thing that a shipper should take from even the discussion we've had here over the last couple of minutes? If you could give them one tidbit to end on.
Well, from a shipper's aspect, I'd say it's, make sure you're working with a fleet that is compliant, and you certainly don't want to be waiting to the last minute to make that decision. As Mike alluded to as well, the time it takes to get rolling with electronic logs implemented and properly trained to deal with enforcement, whatever it may be, deal with the internal training. It's a totally different procedure. It's not something you can afford to just, hope that it's going to work out on December 2017. Yeah. So you need to be prepared.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, I agree with that perspective. I encourage shippers to ask questions. Fleets like Bison are working really hard to be as educated as possible. Shippers don't have to go that alone. We're absolutely prepared and willing to communicate, share what we're learning, and help assess their own sort of potential risks or gaps, and then provide sort of ideas on how to get through that. But yeah, ask questions, have some dialogue about it. I think the industry is quite open to talking about how we best get through this. It's a positive change for our industry. Shippers and carriers alike will help with ultimately our reputation as a business and a industry. So we're looking forward to doing it well as we go through.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. Well, that wraps up things for today. So thank you all for taking time to be able to listen to our discussion about ELDs from a shipper's perspective. As you heard, it is a very complex topic that is not as simple as just turning on a piece of technology, and really we need to build a culture around that technology in the process. We actually have put together an ELD guide. It's called the A to Z guide for shippers on ELDs. So we'll have actually a link below where you can download that guide if you'd like to get some more specifics. Also, we'll put the details up for SHA tracking. so you can find out more about what their technology and their people have to offer your business as well. But thank you again, both Mike and Steve, for your time today, and thank you for watching.
Thank you.